Now, the final local scope property we're going to talk about is the ampersand local scope property. Now, this one has a very different purpose from the at or the equals that we've covered up to this point. So let's jump in and see what we can do with it. So we've talked about how when we build this wall, we can get data in and out by using either the at or the equals as appropriate. But what if a click or something happens in the directive? How would we notify the parent scope that that occurred? Well, you could potentially resort to broadcast or an emit or something like that. But in this case, because the scope is isolated, that can bring its own challenges. So what we're going to do here is we're going to allow the parent scope through this ampersand property to pass in a function that we can then store in our directive isolate scope. And then we can invoke that function and call that function, whatever it is, we'll call it a callback function in the parent scope. Now, you can also use it with data binding expressions and do some other things there, but we're going to focus mostly on function callbacks. So here be an example. Let's say the person on the left wants to call over to the person on the right, just using standard cell phones nowadays. So we'd have, hey, call me back at this number. So the person on the right, which we're going to say is the directive, would then store that. Now, to make that possible so that we can pass this callback into the directive, we're going to be using this ampersand. Now, once that person is done over on the right, they might call back to that 123, 1234 number, which invokes some function we're going to say. Now, obviously in a cell phone, it calls the physical phone, but you're going to see for our purposes and in directives, we're going to be using this function callback. And by doing this, that'll allow the outside world to pass in a function, we can store it, and then invoke it to call them back. And it works out really well. So from a code standpoint, it looks like this. Let's say that the outer kind of parent controller has this click that's associated with a function. And when that's invoked, it does whatever. It might show a dialog or something like that. But what we want is the directive to be able to know about this function right here, so that when something happens in the directive, it can actually call the function. Well, to do that, you'll notice that in my isolate scope, I have a property called action, but instead of the at or the equals, we're going to use the ampersand. And the ampersand simply represents that we can pass in a function, and think of it like a function pointer if you're familiar with that, or we can even pass in some type of an expression that gets evaluated. So now, as the directive is invoked, something happens. This function that would be called or passed in would be stored in action. We simply invoke action in the directive, which in turn calls this function. So you can kind of think of action as just acting as an alias, a temporary kind of pointer, if you will, to this click function here. So when it comes to using and defining this, it would look like the following. So we have our directive, and on it we have an action property. But notice that the value here is, in this example, not passing a string or an object. We're actually passing a function, which technically is an object in JavaScript. So what will happen is the function itself gets passed in. Action is just an alias now for this function. And so down here in the directive, when we write code to invoke the action property, really all that's going to do is process the code up in this function. So it's a great way when a directive is performing some type of an operation to be able to call back out of the directive into some type of a function, or to even run an expression that might be here. So let's take a look at how this one works.